Welcome to this joint Asia-Scotland Institute and Defence and Security Forum webinar this afternoon. I'd like to hand over to Roddy Gow, the Chairman and Founder of the Asia-Scotland Institute. Thank you.
Doug, thank you very much indeed, and thank you to everybody who is linked in listening to this call. We'll be introducing our panelists in a moment, but I wanted first of all to welcome you to this webinar. We have been discovering in the world that there are all sorts of areas of potential flashpoints and tensions, and not alone, of course, COVID-19, but the issue of China and her neighbors and the relationships with China around the world are constantly in the news. So this is a very important moment to pause and stop and take stock of what is going on there, and I'm absolutely delighted that we are doing this in partnership with Defence and Security Forum. A brief word on the Asia-Scotland Institute. We're 8 years old. Our inner core mission is to educate and inspire tomorrow's leaders in Scotland and elsewhere, and to do so by exploring what is going on in Asia, Pan-Asia, defined as being from Syria in the west to Japan in the east. And it's a particular pleasure for me to be doing this with Lady Olga Maitland and DSF, and I'm now going to ask her to introduce herself, her organization, and say a few words. Olga, thank you.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Roddy. And may I just say what a pleasure it is for me to partner with Asia-Scotland Institute. Defence and Security Forum, well, we are a little bit older than you are. We were launched in 1983, and we've been going from strength to strength ever since. So I really do welcome the opportunity of looking outside our normal area. We look at security, but really you cannot separate security from all the geopolitical issues around the world, and Asia is absolutely critical. And I'm very proud of the fact that Paul Beaver will be participating in our discussions. He's on the line, I think, or not, and will be giving very valuable insights because of his own background, because he was editor-in-chief of Jane's Defence Weekly. Now, for a few moments that I have on air, I would like to look at just what options are there for India. And the fact is they are pretty limited, and there are some very uncomfortable truths ahead. India cannot afford a full-scale military standoff against China. It would actually lose. So what can they do? Economic boycott? The fact is, it is difficult to disentangle from China. Any attempt to inflict quick economic pain on China is expected to hurt Indians themselves. Chinese components are a crucial part of the India supply chain. India depends on China for antibiotics, raw materials for its pharmaceutical industry, telecom sector, components for solar panels. Even India's car industry depends heavily on some Chinese parts. To cap it all, India sources Chinese raw materials for bulletproof vests, so there is an irony there, bearing in mind the conflict. In reality, any attempt to inflict quick economic pain on China is expected to hurt Indians themselves, and there would be a backlash. India cannot decouple from China. It's not possible, as we have seen. In a market economy, how can you tell a consumer, don't buy cheap Chinese products, buy the more expensive and perhaps in all reality, poorer quality from elsewhere? And in short, India imported in 2018 $76 billion worth of products. So massive dependency. So where does India go? President Modi would like to limit Chinese companies' access to the Indian markets. Well, that's easier said than done. If India decides to press ahead with higher tariffs, customs delays, stiffer regulation on Chinese investment, it has to do it with care. Disrupting manufacturing industries still reeling from lockdown and create shortages of critical products will test the public mood. Well, at the moment, the mood is to punish China, but any boycott of Chinese products would not amount to a decent slap. China can carry it, but can India withstand the economic impact for long? And I rather look forward to our panelists who are going to take a very broad view on the whole perspectives to see what are the options and how things are likely to go forward, particularly in today's world where China is becoming more assertive than ever before. So maybe a small border conflict high up in the valleys may not be quite so limited after all. And on that note, I'd like to hand back to Roddy.
Olga, thank you very much. And I think that Paul is going to join us. I can't see him at the moment. We hope we will. But let me start off not only by thanking you for that very interesting resume of what's going on, but by introducing the two speakers who I can see. First of all, Dr. Tanvi Madan. We're delighted she's joining us from the United States. Tanvi is a senior fellow in the Project on International Order and Strategy in the Foreign Policy Program and a director of the India Project at the Brookings Institution in Washington. Her work explores India's role in the world and its foreign policy, focusing in particular on India's relations with China and the United States. So she could hardly have more relevant background. Recently quoted I'm looking at the Guardian Weekly, she says, "I suspect China has lost another generation in India, many of whom had seen China as an opportunity. Basically, now they will say, we can't trust them." Even if there was already an internal debate, this has strengthened the hands of those who have called for a rethinking, she said. And rather, as you have been saying, Olga, one thing this will put an end to is the idea that economic interdependence is going to alleviate political strains. And Aaditya from the Royal United Services Institute is a research analyst and author focusing on South Asia in the Internal Security Studies Department at RUSI. His research interests include South Asian foreign policy, regional security, and strategic dynamics, Chinese engagement with South Asia, and conflict resolution and reconciliation. And as an ex-military man, I would like to say, let's start off by asking Aaditya to take us to what's going on the ground, where this confrontation took place in mid-June, and scope out for us what he sees. Aaditya.
Thank you very much, Roddy, and thank you, Doug and Lady Maitland, for the introductions, and thank you for having me here. So just to start off, I just like to lay out sort of what we know about what's happening on the ground at the moment. Just to be clear, we don't know everything. We don't know a lot of details that are currently, we don't know a lot of the current details just because of the limited information and the inaccessible terrain, etc. So, I mean, the current discussion has really kicked off since the crisis began in early May. We had reports of clashes between Indian and Chinese troops in two areas along the line of actual control, along the Indo-China border. One along Pangong Lake, which is in Ladakh, and one in Nakula in northern Sikkim, which is in the sort of eastern sector of the India-China border. Following that, essentially, there was a massing of troops by both sides. Initially, a lot of Chinese troops came in various areas along the line of actual control, specifically in Ladakh, in multiple different sectors. So this map itself just shows the disputed borders between India and China across the different sectors. The area in question is the sort of the top blue area, currently in Ladakh, which is where the current clashes are, current crisis is unfolding. The earlier clash in Sikkim that we saw was right next to Bhutan in that small sliver of territory there in the northern Sikkim there. Just to go to the next, just to explain sort of the line of actual control itself, the line isn't actually a line demarcated on the ground. The two sides have not mutually defined their border. It is not delineated on any maps mutually, and nor is it demarcated on the ground. So there is a lot of blur, like haziness and confusion around where actually the border lies, which lends itself to confrontations when border patrols face each other on the ground. Going over to the sort of next slide, what we see right now is essentially confrontations happening in multiple areas in Ladakh, largely. The three most prominent areas where the confrontations have taken place are in the three areas marked on this map, which is the Galwan Valley region, the Hot Springs region, and Pangong Lake. Recently, we have also seen reports of Chinese troops moving into an area called Depsang, which is slightly north of the Galwan Valley region, and opening up a sort of possibly a new front for this crisis. The current crisis is mainly focused on two areas: Hot Springs, Galwan Valley, and on two areas: the Galwan Valley region and Pangong Lake. To just begin with the first area itself, this is a map from an Indian news channel, which sort of shows the broad area we're talking about here. The clashes themselves have been focused around patrolling point 14, which is right along the line of actual control between India and China in the Galwan Valley region. There is a sort of dispute between the two in terms of where the line of actual control lies. The Chinese side has had a variety of different versions of its line of actual control in the region, which lends itself to quite a lot of confusion. And in recent weeks, we have seen that they have asserted their claim to the entire valley, which extends up to the confluence between the Shyok and the Galwan rivers, which are indicated here. According to India, of course, the LAC is where the LAC is marked on this particular map, and according to map coordinates shared by a former sort of foreign secretary of India, they align with this map. Those coordinates were shared during a sort of official India-China exchange discussing the border dispute. The clash itself that sparked the most recent interest on 15th of June, which led to the deaths of 20 Indian soldiers and a sort of unknown number of Chinese troops, happened at this flashpoint. We don't know the full details of the clash itself, but we do know that it was a sort of particularly brutal clash. No firearms were used, but it was fought using melee weapons and stones and sort of improvised weapons such as nail-studded rods, etc. And this happened to be the first sort of incident in which there were fatalities along the India-China border since 1975, and the first clash of this scale and intensity since 1967, when there was a clash in the Sikkim area. There are sort of multiple reasons that have been put forward for why this is happening at this particular time. One of the main reasons that have been put forward is the Indian construction of border infrastructure along the line of actual control, which essentially, since the mid-2000s, India has attempted to address a large sort of border infrastructure gap between India and China along their borders. India has sort of an airfield in northern Ladakh, close to the Karakoram Pass, called the Daulat Beg Odi airfield, which was not connected by road for very long until this particular road, the DSDBO road, was completed quite recently last year, which is an all-weather road which allows Indian road access to that airfield in northern Ladakh. This has been a long-standing border infrastructure in India, has been a sort of long-standing concern from the Chinese side. Although the Chinese have constructed a lot of infrastructure, roads, railways on their side of the line of actual control as well, which allows them easier access to the border itself. Indian troops have, until quite recently and even now, in many of the sectors, are forced to sort of go on foot patrolling towards the border, and roads only extend to quite a few kilometers before, stop quite a few kilometers before the line of actual control itself. I'll just quickly then move on to what we've seen in terms of this attempts at de-escalation, recent de-escalation attempts. There have been 3 core commander level meetings since this crisis began on June 6th, June 22nd, and June the 30th. It is notable, of course, that this particular violent clash happened after the June 6th clash, when the disengagement process was supposed to be in process. And progressively, we've seen that there hasn't really been much movement in spite of repeated sort of commitments from both sides in terms of moving their troops back from the crisis areas.
So thank you very much. Tanvi.
Thank you very much, Roddy. What I'm going to do is lay out some of the potential geopolitical implications of the crisis. What might it do to how particularly India sees its partnerships as well as its relationship with China? A couple of caveats that what I will talk about in terms of what could happen with India's, for example, relations with China, with the US, with Russia, with other partners that India has, will depend on 2 things. It will depend, one, on the duration, evolution, and outcome of the crisis. And second, it will depend on the posture and responsiveness of India's partners in the short term and the medium term as well. On the India-China side, what we have seen is a hardening of the rhetoric, both from the Indian government. The Indian Prime Minister has not mentioned China by name, but we've heard a number of other officials very clearly say that this boundary crisis, and particularly the deaths of the Indian soldiers, as Aaditya mentioned, the first fatalities in 45 years, that these developments will have a serious impact on the broader China-India relationship. This is also a way for India to send a signal to China that this is not just about pieces of land. It will have reverberations for the broader relationship if it is not resolved. You've also seen in the broader establishment amongst kind of the strategic community in India, especially the foreign and security policy community, amongst especially China hands, a call for a reassessment of the entire China-India relationship, a sense that the whole architecture of agreements, protocols, and norms that had been agreed to over the last many years to ensure that an incident like that of June 15th does not actually take place, that China has violated those agreements. And so not just those agreements, but the broader relationship needs to be reassessed. You've also seen now an impact on India's policies towards China, and particularly, as Adi Maitland mentioned, on the economic side. We've seen reports of the government changing procurement guidance for telecom companies, which of course could have implications for Huawei. We've seen India ban 59 Chinese apps. And we've seen, and both these in terms of the telecom and the technology sector are not just about this incident or to try to punish China or as retaliation. These are moves that had been considered for a while, particularly some of the apps. There were concerns about data security and privacy. And these are considered sensitive sectors. And so this was up for debate. And I think this is where you can see in terms of the debates about will this be a turning point in the China-India relationship. What this has done within the system, within the government, is it has strengthened the hands of those arguing for India to take a tougher stance towards China, for those who are arguing that economic ties will not alleviate political strains. You've also seen some state governments, for instance, talk about how they've been told by the central government in India that no more contracts should be signed with Chinese companies for any state projects until they receive additional scrutiny. So you have already seen some changes in terms of policies, and even among public sentiment, you have seen anti-China sentiment go mainstream in a way that's usually reserved for India's other rival, Pakistan. What could lead this kind of sentiment building towards China or against China to settle down a bit? I think the only thing that could really do that is a quick resolution and China returning the situation to the status quo ante. That does not seem likely at the moment, but that is the only thing that I could see that could fundamentally kind of change this trajectory we seem to be on. What impact will this have on the India-US relationship? India-US ties are in some ways intimately connected to India-China ties. The US and India and the US has shared concerns for a number of years of arising China's behavior have led them to cooperate with each other. It is a key part of what has been driving the US-India relationship, particularly on the defense and security side over the last 2 decades. What we've seen from the US in the last few weeks is statements from the Trump administration criticizing Chinese assertiveness, seeing this move as part of a broader pattern of Chinese assertiveness in terms of what it's doing in Hong Kong, what it's done against Australia, Canada, Taiwan, not to mention a number of South China Sea claimants, Malaysia, the Philippines, and Vietnam. And they've also blamed China for escalating tensions in the situation with India. You've seen members of the US Congress from both sides of the aisle call China a bully, essentially. Some have even gone as far as calling the June 15th clash premeditated aggression on the part of China. And so you have seen kind of the US, perhaps the only country so far that has called out China by name on this issue. You've seen the Japanese make some statements today about not liking unilateral changes of the status quo, but so far, I think the US is the only one that has spoken up for its own interests and reasons as well. One of the debates in terms of the broader term geopolitical implications has been what this will do to the broader US-India relationship. And that debate often kind of comes on the grounds of, will India remain non-aligned or will it form an alliance with the US? I don't think that's the best framing for the choice or what might lie ahead. I understand why it's framed that way, that it's because of the Cold War. But as this crisis is made evident to a number of people, including a number of Indian policymakers, the choices facing India will not be the same as the ones it faced in the Cold War. In the case of US-China competition, for one, there is an Indian adversary that is involved in that competition, China. One that it has aligned against at least twice in the Cold War in 1962 and 1971. And China is the country India has arguably been building a network of partners to balance against for the last 2 decades. So it will not be the same choice for India in terms of trying to walk a middle path. The foreign minister, Dr. S. Jaishankar, before he had taken office, had said, when told, will India choose between the US and China, he had said, India will choose, India will make India's choice. He will choose India's choice and India's preference. And I believe that what this boundary crisis will do is that it will make Indian policymakers find that their choice, what they see as India's interest, will be aligned far more often with the US than with China. One thing that is already clear is that the US and India are already fairly aligned, especially in the defense and security space. And you've seen in previous crises, the US offer not just, including in 2017, when China and India were facing off in Doklam, you saw the US extend not just diplomatic support, but also share intelligence with India. And another way the US plays a role is help enhance Indian military capabilities. So even in the current crisis, you're seeing American equipment that India has acquired from the US play a role, whether that is strategic airlift capability, or it is Chinook helicopters, or it's even India's maritime reconnaissance aircraft, the P-8Is, that are flying over kind of in this territorial airspace.
Thank you. That's wonderful. I'm going to just pause there. I think Paul has now joined us. Paul Beaver is a strategy advisor and historian with a special interest in China and the South China Sea. He was previously editor-in-chief of Jane's Defence Weekly, a well-known publication, and was an advisor to the House of Commons Defence Committee for 15 years. And he now advises companies and countries on a variety of strategy matters, from space to armoured vehicles. And so, Paul, you can give us your advice on what you think is developing here in this corner of the world.
Roddy, thank you. To me, this is about a number of issues. It's about wider implications. This is about China's assertiveness. This is about pressure. And Tanvi's really right. We've heard of, it's Bhutan, it's Pakistan, it's the South China Sea, it's Australia, it's Taiwan, it's Hong Kong. This is China flexing some muscles. This is because politically right in the center of the Chinese People's Communist Party, Xi Jinping told everybody he would have it under control. He'd get Hong Kong sorted, that would make Taiwan come in, and by the end of his leadership, there would be a much bigger China, and the South China Sea would be there, and all these things would be in the right place. So why is China doing this? China's doing this, I think, for a number of reasons. It's doing it as part of influence, the Belt and Road Initiative, 74 countries involved, everyone now busily getting themselves into debt to China to do this. And you know, if you look at the maps of that, there's some very good maps on Google that indicate this. It's also, in some places, it's about water. The Brahmaputra, for example, is about moving water to the north of China to fertilize the desert, or to irrigate the desert, I should say. And it's also about timing. The Chinese are really good at timing, whether it's long term or very short term. And the very short term opportunity is COVID. And they've looked at COVID and they've seen the opportunity which had come out of this, that India had withdrawn some of its forces from the border area for very good reasons to do with health. And it saw that opportunity to move forward. And so it took it. China is very good at doing that. So you get here in the geopolitical space all the right mix for Beijing to say, well, let's give it a go. Let's push some of these things. We've got more and more support in the world because of the BRI, the Belt and Road Initiative. They've convinced countries to de-recognize Taiwan, if that is a functional expression. And they've probed a bit. There's a sinking of a Vietnamese ship. They put some pressure on Pakistan to up its Chinese relationship. Chinese aircraft exercising at the moment with Pakistan, and of course Pakistan tends to buy its equipment from China, where India used to from India before it got into bed with America. There's lots going on here that is more than just a group of soldiers having a fisticuffs with clubs and stones, because thank goodness they didn't use firearms or artillery or aircraft or whatever. But we have seen this continual pressure that China's put on. So my focus is very much on looking at the moment at China and saying, what is China getting out of this? And what do they want? They see themselves every day in the newspapers under pressure because of Huawei, because of what they're doing in Australia, because of Hong Kong, the new security laws, and they're diverting attention. It's an old trick, it's a tried and tested one, and China uses it really well. It's going to be up to India to demonstrate how mature it is in the way it deals with this. And so far, I have to say it's been a lot more restrained than I thought it would be. So Roddy, I hope that's a good enough introduction.
It's a wonderful introduction, Pablo. And now I'm going to ask Olga if she would like to respond, and then perhaps we can go back to Aaditya and Tanvi, and then we can open it up for questions. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much indeed. I must say, Paul, well done for basically filling out the picture, which was so ably put for us by Tanvi and Aaditya. One point really kind of comes out of it, to my mind, is how India is going to try and prevent itself becoming a tool of either one superpower or another. If they get drawn into the American orbit too far, then frankly, they then become a puppet of America, and it may not actually serve their interests. On the other hand, they have had a very long relationship with China. It was a pretty good one, actually, bearing in mind these various small frictions. But if they see themselves as a major power down in Asia, then I think they're going to have to try and take a more careful line, not always going down the Trump route. And also, paradoxically, their relationship with their rivals in Pakistan, it makes Pakistan rows look rather puny compared to their much bigger and more economically powerful neighbor being China. So I think Modi will have to be quite canny about how he's going to play it, bearing in mind he hasn't got a great many cards to play. But I put that out to all of you to make a comment, perhaps Paul to first, and then we'll go back to Tanvi and Aaditya. Paul.
Olga, I absolutely agree with you. I think from the perspective of geopolitics, it's very important at the moment for Donald Trump to see if he can get some friends on board. He wants a trade agreement with Britain, for example. He wants to show he's being strong with India because he needs the votes in November. So I think for India to get too close to America, as you say, is wrong. I think that's the same for the United Kingdom, I have to say as well, that we have to be very careful how we play that card. But for me, the whole of this is about understanding Beijing and the Chinese Communist Party and the way that China does things. We have to look at it from the Chinese perspective and see what they get out of it. And at the moment, they are in the driving seat because they're the ones that are taking the initiatives, bad though they might appear to us to be.
And I was wondering Tanvi, what your feeling is looking at it from the American axis.
Sure, I think, one of the things is that for India, India's problems with China are not because of the US, though occasionally Beijing does try to say that. These are Indian problems with China that go back. India has seen China as a significant challenge since the mid to late 1950s. More consistently than perhaps any other major power in the world. And it's seen China as a challenge, if not a threat, alone and in conjunction with Pakistan, China and Pakistan are very close. China has helped build Pakistani nuclear and military capabilities. So it sees those problems as linked. Its military plans for a two-front war. It has to, given the history of that triangle. And so this is a China that India has seen as a challenge for a while. It is not the same as its relationship with the US. The US, at least for the last 20 years, has been an Indian partner, not an ally, but they have been aligned, particularly in the subject of balancing China. And so India finds the US useful for two reasons. The US helps India build its own capabilities. It helps, along with other US allies and partners, balance China. And what India thinks the US is indispensable for is ensuring that Asia is not a unipolar Asia dominated by Beijing. Just very quickly, for India, the choice when it looks at the US and China, it looks very different from the choice that perhaps faces the UK or even a country like Singapore. This is because for India, when it's looking at US-China, it's not going to go join a bloc. It will join coalitions of the willing. Sometimes that include China, depending on certain issues. But when it looks at the US and China, it looks at a country on the one hand, the US that has been a partner. It still has doubts about that country's reliability, about the consistency of its China policy. But 3 or 4 administrations now have converged with India on the subject of China. On the other hand, India sees China, which, to put it very bluntly, is its #1 adversary. So I think the situation looks very different. And if China is in the driver's seat, one thing it has done, it's driving India further into US arms. And if the idea was to prevent that, I'm afraid its moves are going to have the opposite effect.
And I was wondering, Aaditya, from your military perspective, are you going to see any change of posture there in India?
So, I mean, currently the signs I don't think are extremely promising. We've seen 3 core commander level meetings which have not resulted in any sort of sustainable disengagement. There hasn't really been any moves towards that. De-escalation is a little bit further away at the moment. We did today see Prime Minister Modi actually go to Ladakh and make a statement to the troops there, which is sort of, I mean, I assume is a signal of sort of resolve rather than anything else. It wasn't like it wasn't a big it wasn't presenting options or anything of that sort, but it was more a signal of resolve from the Indian government. We've also seen, as I think Tanvi mentioned, a hardening from the Ministry of External Affairs in recent weeks, in recent couple of weeks, in terms of its position there. But I think just to add also to what Tanvi said in terms of the US relationship and the sort of foreign policy approach, I think India still, I mean, regardless of what others say about it, I think it still favors a strategic autonomy approach where it's going to align with different powers on different issues. And it doesn't agree with the US on everything. There has been a greater alignment with the US on particularly the China question, but it's a large part of its military equipment still comes from Russia, which is obviously a traditional US adversary. And that isn't likely to change anytime soon, even though it might trend away from it in the long term. In addition, I think India's dilemma, or India's decision, is more likely to be, rather than going straight into the US camp, is also going to be more towards a diversification of its relationships, not just moving towards the US, but looking at other sort of middle powers in the region, like Australia, Japan, France, and perhaps Vietnam, Indonesia, those kind of powers as well on specific issues. So yeah.
Aditya, thank you.
Roddy, thank you very much indeed. Yes, if I could ask Walter, Walter Ludwig, are you there? I know you have a question for Tanvi.
Hi, Walter Ludwig from King's College London. I'd like to ask Dr. Madan, what could or should countries like the US or UK and others be doing if they want to support India in this episode? I know you've written elsewhere that India doesn't want to see this turn into a geopolitical football. Do they just stay silently supportive, or is there something practical that can be done? Thank you.
I think what you've actually seen is a bit of a change from the early part of the crisis before the June 15th incident, when you saw India not want the US to say very much, because it didn't want the situation to escalate. It didn't want China to see this as part of US-China competition. You've seen over the last few weeks, particularly after the June 15th incident, and especially after the talks that Aaditya mentioned don't seem to have been resulting in very much change on the ground. You've seen India essentially seem to give the green lights to friends of its friends to say things that are supportive. And so a number of statements you've seen from the US have come since then. Today, the Japanese ambassador to India talked about, as I mentioned, that they disapprove of countries unilaterally changing the status quo. You've seen others kind of give more neutral statement. Russia has been striking because, as Aaditya mentioned, it is a long-standing Indian partner, but it has a close partnership with China these days, and it has not criticized the Chinese moves against India. And so I think what India is and what countries should do is, if they do want to be supportive, I think take the lead from India, and that is what the US seems to be doing, which is taking the lead from India in terms of requesting support, but in the meantime, preparing themselves in terms of diplomatic support, rhetorical support, what they're willing to do, but particularly in terms of if India needs enhancement, a very speedy enhancement of some of its military capabilities, be prepared for that. As well as in the case of the US, there's an ability now, because of various agreements that have been signed, for the two countries to share information, but also to be in close touch quite regularly. These mechanisms are in place. So I think it will be very different for different countries. Some will not want to get involved, and particularly because of their relations with China, but because of the mood in the US these days, both amongst Democrats and Republicans, you've seen very little sympathy for the Chinese position on this.
Thank you very much.
Tanvi, thank you. I have a question from Joe.
I understand, like I said, this forum's primarily focused on the India-China dispute. However, Pakistan tends to play a big factor, especially as a thorn in the side of India and an all-weather ally of China. I read earlier this week an article where India accused Pakistan of massing troops along the line of control, the Pakistan-India border, and allegedly hosting Chinese aircraft at their air bases. Just be interested to see what the panel thinks of this, and what they assess Pakistan might do, and the potential Indian responses or response options to a Pakistan and a more assertive Pakistan.
One of the things that, as I mentioned, there is always a concern about, the LOC has been, the line of control that separates India and Pakistan has been hot for a while, so to speak. There have been a number of skirmishes, and it's been quite different from the line of actual control for a number of decades, because the set of, the architecture of agreements that exist with China do not exist with Pakistan. So you've seen a fair bit of kind of heat on that side for a while now. Some of this is related to the fact that it's because the weather, once spring and summer sets in, you tend to see these skirmishes go back. But what India will have to plan for, and the military does plan for, is, and they will be concerned about, is any coordinated action or action that Pakistan might take to distract India from its China front. And so any coordinated action between China and Pakistan, this is something that the Indian government has been concerned about for decades. But there's also, even in the present situation, they will have to keep in mind that this is a possibility, and it is something that the Indian military war games consistently.
Thank you. Paul, would you like to say anything briefly?
Delighted, thank you. Yeah, I think that there are a couple of things, Joe, here. Certainly Pakistan is hosting Chinese aircraft, and they do this regularly. They operate the same sort of aircraft, and there's a lot of work that goes on between them. The other thing is, I think it was the 14th of June when there was an issue in Kashmir. I think 2 Indians were kidnapped. 2 Indian civilians. I don't know what the outcome of that was, but I remember seeing that flash up. So there's always a little bit of hostility there, and Tanvi's absolutely right. The relationship between India and Pakistan is different between the relationship between India and China, which is a lot more grown up, if you like. So that's between cousins. And the relationship of India and Pakistan is between squabbling siblings, is the way that I'd look at it, one being smaller than the other, perhaps, but just as good a boxer.
Paul, thank you very much indeed. I'm going to ask John Delves if he'd ask a question. I understand he's got a question about resources, and perhaps, Aaditya, if you could answer this, I think this is probably more appropriate. Thank you.
Hi, John Delves here in New York. What is this about? Is it about mineral resources, water, territory, access, or something else? What is China's end game?
So I mean, that's, I think, quite a difficult question, just because of the opacity in general Chinese decision making, at least from an external perspective. But I think a lot of it probably does have to do with sort of the perceptions and conceptions of territorial integrity on both sides. Particularly, I think, in terms of, for India, for example, Aksai Chin is historically sort of part of the broader princely state of Jammu and Kashmir. And also for China as well, it is a key sort of node where they created a national highway connecting Xinjiang and Tibet, which is one of the key connecting highways for those 2 regions. So I think that's what it is currently largely about. I think for both countries, the question of territorial integrity and sovereignty is quite sensitive given their histories. I don't think it is necessarily, I mean, I might be wrong, but I've not read anything of the sort that it is about sort of necessarily minerals or water at this moment. But certainly territorial integrity is a sensitive question for both, not just in Ladakh, but also in the eastern sector when it comes to Arunachal Pradesh, which is also, which China claims as part of southern Tibet.
Aaditya, thank you very much indeed. I'm going to ask Pankaj if you ask your question, and perhaps I think, Tanvi, if perhaps you could answer this question first, and if there's any other comments from that last question that you would want to add, then please do. Pankaj, are you there?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Yeah, I was just wondering what India loses out by aligning itself with the US. I mean, obviously there are economic issues, it imports heavily from China, but apart from that, I mean, particularly with Donald Trump being the president of the US, who flip-flops all the time, what does India lose out?
So I think, one of the things, this is why I mentioned that this is not about an alliance. India doesn't want one, and the US is not offering one. So it's not a traditional NATO-style formal alliance that anybody is talking about. What it means is India getting close to the US. But as Aaditya pointed out, and I've written about extensively, India will continue to follow what it has for a number of decades. It's been the most consistent element of Indian foreign policy, which is diversification. It does not trust external actors, any of them. It does not think they are reliable at the end of the day. It thinks that it needs to depend on itself. It has an independent deterrent in terms of nuclear weapons now. What it will do is, as it has done for the last few decades, I see this boundary crisis as reinforcing trends rather than creating new ones, perhaps accelerating them. A closer relationship with the US that will allow it to deter China in a better way, to build its own capabilities, but also maintain relations with a number of countries, as Aaditya mentioned, and with Russia. Partly because it, at the moment, has no choice. It is, however, extremely concerned about how close Russia is getting to China and what that might mean for Russia's willingness and its ability over time to supply and support India in these kind of situations. And so it'll take a neutral Russia, but it doesn't necessarily like a neutral Russia. So I think the situation with the US is not about expecting the US to come to rescue India in any way. What are the downsides? The downsides are that, you know, the Chinese, there has been a school of thought in India that the closer that India gets to the US, the more upset China gets with it. But as a number of Indian analysts have now pointed out, well, India has even not done certain things with the US, and other countries, for example, the Philippines, was almost not signing a new visiting forces agreement, and the Chinese still went after them. So it's not clear that whether or not one is holding back in relations with the US is going to make a difference. The Russians do not like a closer US-India relationship, but I think they also know they cannot veto that. Just on the previous subject, I think Aaditya outlined what this is about. The one thing I would add is some people have mentioned, talked about why are these countries, fighting over or trying to, why is this face off over this piece of land that seems, you know, in rough terrain, at high altitude, treacherous terrain. It's because it's quite strategic. If you think about the maps that Aaditya put out there, it's where kind of it's for India where the China-Pakistan, just up north, where China and Pakistan link up. It is where this is the area that gives India access to its northernmost advanced landing ground that helps supply all its troops to the boundary. And it is possible that China would like for that access to be constrained or at least restricted, or it is concerned about it. So there is a strategic element, or at least an element of it that is about the operational value of this kind of territory.
Tanvi, thank you very much indeed. I've got one last question, which I'm going to ask Guy, if you'd ask your question. Please, thank you.
Thank you very much. What would be the implications of a Biden victory in the US elections in November?
It's one of the things I think it will depend on is what this will mean for US-China policy. At the moment, the Republicans and Democrats are in a race to point out who is going to compete more with and challenge China more. I think that, at least in terms of what a number of advisors have said to Vice President Biden and his campaign, have talked about seeing the China-India situation as Paul mentioned, as a part of a pattern of assertiveness and aggressiveness. They have criticized the Trump administration for allowing this to happen by not showing resolve and commitment to allies and partners. And so what they have talked about is that they will continue to compete with China, but they will do it in a smarter fashion, for example, by working more closely with allies and partners in the region and Europe as well. There is, though, there are a couple of things that I think there will be some that might change some of this. One, if you see a Biden administration that feels that it does need to cooperate with China, things like pandemics or climate change, what will the price that Beijing asks for that be? And will the Biden administration step back on some of these competitive aspects to be able to get that cooperation from China? But the second thing is there is going to be, as all countries are suffering from COVID and the health and economic consequences of this will play out in the US as well, there is, especially amongst the progressive side, a sense here that the US needs to spend less on defense. It needs to focus on rebuilding at home. And so that debate will be watched very closely in terms of what will this mean for US commitment in the region. It doesn't have to mean that allies and partners will feel kind of left out. But it could mean that the US expects them to burden share more in a way that even the Trump administration has called for.
Thank you.
Tanvi, thank you. I don't know if, Paul, if you've got anything else you would wish to add before I hand over to Roddy.
The only thing, thank you, the only thing I would say on this is everybody, I think, at the moment is paused because of COVID. And this is not going away quickly. I think we're going to be paused with COVID for a while. And I think that the concentration of government action, you just have to see that in the United Kingdom, is that it's everyone is focusing in at the moment. And hence China's assertiveness. I think they're taking advantage of this. It's big enough. It's got a broader view on life. We shouldn't be surprised if there aren't more of these Chinese incursions, issues, pressures, all the way around. And I would draw our attention to the changes in the Arctic Council, in which China wants to play a greater part because it wants to have a sea route to Europe, to the northeast, which goes through what Russia considers to be its territorial waters. Watch this one from November.
Paul, thank you for those comments, and thank you everybody on the panel for your contributions. It sort of smacks of the great game, doesn't it, in the 19th century somewhat. And this thing of powers taking advantage of a situation and seizing an initiative when others are focused or their attention is diverted towards either domestic or, in this case, healthcare related issues. It's a time immemorial. Anybody studying the classics will know too that that happens. And I don't know whether we are indeed, as some have suggested, looking at a Thucydides trap as the United States weakens and China inexorably strengthens back to a position that it was in, let us not forget, 200 years ago. Because 200 years ago, India and China were the two largest economies in the world, and so it is becoming again. But this has been a fascinating conversation, and I'm very grateful to panelists and those who've asked questions. And Doug, to you, and I would ask Olga if she's there, if she would like to, I will cede her the right to make some concluding remarks. Olga.
Well, thank you very much indeed. This has been a very illuminating as a webinar. I have to say our panelists were all extraordinarily strong, and I think it created a very interesting review all round. From my perspective, standing right back, I slightly wonder, what is China really going to get out of all this? Was it in fact a scrap which got out of control by local commanders and they then had to try and make good? If China wants to make friends and influence people, who would have thought they've been doing it more effectively by other means. I'm slightly puzzled that China is slightly in a way boxing itself in by being assertive and aggressive. It means it's not the best way to make friends and influence people. So puzzled by that. The silence of Russia is interesting, and I think it's something that perhaps should be examined at another date, because Russia has been shifting towards China as a new ally, but China will indeed swallow up and bite the ankle of the Russians, so they're not going to come out of it the best. But I think at the end of the day, it'll be interesting to see the statesmanship of Modi, how he forges a path which is independent, and I think bringing his own allies on board, and fair enough, for all sorts of very natural reasons, to have a good relationship with America. There are lots of synergies there, but to do it at the expense of showing his own independence and subtlety, I think is going to be very, very important indeed. And clearly, he is caught in a very difficult position because he hasn't really got many cards to play. It'll have to be diplomacy. He hasn't got the physical manpower. He may be a nuclear weapons state. The last thing he should do and want is to go into a military conflict. That's out of the question. Economically, he's not that strong. So he's got to lose a lot more subtleties and a lot more allies to get it smoothly onto a new even keel. But what an amazing seminar. And I think we've all profited by this enormously. Thank you, Roddy, for bringing us all together.
Olga, thank you. And I forgot, I ought to draw attention to Tanvi's book, Fateful Triangle. I can see there's a copy on the credenza behind you there. So that is, encourage you all to go and look for that. And Olga, thank you for that. And as always, it's a huge pleasure for us to hold an event with the Defence and Security Forum.
Thank you.
Your members, many of whom are listening. And so, Doug, over to you now to close us off after this very interesting webinar, and having the Royal United Services Institute and Brookings and DSF and Pablo all together on one thing is truly amazing, a delectable delight and recipe. Doug.
Thank you very much indeed. And I just ask anybody watching, if you want to know about our future events, you'll be able to see them on our website, www.asiascot.com. And we have an event coming up on Indonesia very shortly, as Roddy mentioned earlier. So thank you very much indeed to everybody. Good afternoon.